Welcome everyone to our Renewables for the Home webinar this evening, where we have a panel with people who know a lot about the subject from across Cumbria. Next slide please, Will. Rick, can you? Thank you, yes. So I expect most of you know about Cumbria Action for Sustainability, but just to say very briefly, our vision is a zero carbon Cumbria, and we have a lot of different projects that help us to move towards that. Obviously, here today we're talking about renewables, at other times we're talking about sustainable low energy buildings from the fabric point of view, but we also think about electric vehicles and a whole host of other community projects, biodiversity projects, all kind of different ways that we're looking at making Cumbria gradually a lower carbon county. Thanks, Rick. The next one, please. So this evening I'm going to start with a poll. Then introduce the panel and let the panel talk, introduce themselves really a little bit. Then we'll move on to the Q&A. So we hope you've got lots of questions for us. Do put them in the Q&A, type them in ready for us while we're talking. And then once we've spent probably half an hour or so answering as many questions as we can get through this evening as possible, then I'll move on to a second poll at the end, and thanks, and a close. Next one, thank you, Rick. So the first poll, I'm just about to launch it. You can see the questions there, so you can start thinking, but I will just launch the poll and it's just a case of choosing an option from there. So go for it, answer the question, and we'll run the same questions at the end. It's just helpful for us to see whether you've learnt anything through the webinar and whether it's changed what you're thinking about, to help us understand what it is that you're hoping to get out of it. Okay, so what I'm seeing at the moment is that quite a lot of people saying, I know some of my options, but I'd like to know more. And the other popular answer to question 2 is, I need some advice and I'm thinking of retrofitting or perhaps installing renewables in the next 2 years. So that's great. We'll just click on that. So that shows you, just briefly show you the results. So yes, so I think we've got a lot of people who've got a certain amount of knowledge, but are trying to up their knowledge, and many of you are thinking that you're going to do something at some point in the next couple of years. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So, okay, thanks, Rick. Do you want to go on to the next slide? Thanks. So here we all are. This is the panel, and I'll go and introduce us fully on the next slide. Thank you, Rick. So I'm the CAFS project manager of Holt Cozy Homes Cumbria, and I will say a few words in a moment on Fabric First and Renewables, one, the other, or both, because I often get asked that kind of question, and I'll just say a few thoughts on that. Phil Davis is CAFS SOSCI, or Electric Vehicle Project Manager, and he's going to talk about how he made some decisions on which renewables to use for his home from his sort of perspective as a homeowner. Ewen of Solfit and Love Solar Limited is talking about the benefits of solar power because he installs solar panels. And Richard Waller is another homeowner, PV and EV enthusiast. So he's going to talk to us about how he did that. And Karen Mitchell of Rowland Hill Limited is going to tell us about the heat pumps they install and the battery storage that they work with. So you've got a range of expertise and different perspectives. Thank you, Rick. On to the next. So, yeah, the sad thing about renewable technology, particularly anything solar or anything to do with warmth, is that when we need the heating is December to February, and when we have the sunshine at its peak is June to August. So, in a way, the Fabric First or renewables question, I always like to say, well, they're two very different things. If you want to get your heating bill down, next slide, please, Rick, then you've got to get that December, January, February peak down as much as you can, and that involves insulation, blocking the drafts and so on to reduce your energy demand, and that makes it you're saving a lot then in the winter months. But if you want to install renewables, charge a battery, charge your EV, feed electricity into the grid, then you're going to be generating much of that in the June to August side of things with PV. And of course, heat pumps work well in, the autumn and the spring, but in a really cold snap in the winter, they've got to work that bit harder. So we have a slight mismatch, but we just need to think about the whole problem, the wintertime aspect of the problem, the summertime aspect of what can we generate, what can we do with our PV panels potentially. Next slide, please, Rick. So just to give you an idea, I retrofitted a previous home using the Passivhaus standard as my guide. And our total energy use when we'd finished was about 5,000 kilowatt hours per year, which is tiny. I mean, space heating of 25 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year is very, very small. Very, very hard to get to something as low as that. But it was still bigger than our PV generation because the size of our roof wasn't massive, and we could only generate 3,000 kilowatt hours per year, most of which we generated in the summer and most of which we exported to the grid. So we didn't use a huge amount of our own energy. But because we'd reduced our energy use right down through insulating the house, we were taking a lot less energy to heat our home in the middle of the winter just because of energy efficiency. So we needed to do both really to get our house down to the absolute minimum that we felt was manageable, and that those kind of figures, if many homes in the UK were at that level, that would be great. We wouldn't have too much of an energy problem going on. So both renewables and a fabric first approach work really well together. Thanks, Rick. I'll say a few words about CAFs, and I apologise for everyone who's been on our webinar most recently on Retrofit, because you'll have heard this all before. But we have both free and paid for services for energy advice. So our free Cold to Cosy Homes Cumbria helps people with basic energy advice, and we point them on to schemes where they can get insulation, boilers and so on. And we do our own professionally installed draft proofing for them. We also, through Cold to Cosy Homes Cumbria, offer general short advice phone calls on a specific question. And that is for anyone at all. You can ring in and have those calls for free, whereas the longer energy advice calls for Cold to Cosy Homes, you need to be eligible based on lower incomes or benefits and so on. And then finally, we do webinars and other events like this one to share information with people. On the paid for side, we have a series of audits and different ways of different levels of advice that we can offer. But the key one that we do at the moment is the Home Retrofit Planner. It's a new energy audit service where we model the heat loss scenarios, and we can work out costed improvements to create a whole house plan. And that can include renewables as well as your insulation and so on. We can also go out and do thermal imaging in the winter when it's cold to detect issues and defects in the insulation. And we're going to be doing some training courses over the coming months, certainly the next year. So that's what we're doing at the moment. Rick, do you want to go on to the next? And the latest news is that we have funding for a new project called Retrofit for Cumbria. It's a 2-year project which starts this month, and we're aiming to help 35 households through the process of a deep retrofit, including possibly building fabric improvements, but also renewable technologies such as PV, heat pumps and so on. And this would take those who are involved from the energy advice session that they would probably have, a survey of their own home, but then work through the next steps, the process of actually doing the installation work, where we would be able to provide information on local installers, and we'll be training installers in a wider range of technologies. So let us know if you're thinking of starting a retrofit in the next year and might like to be involved with that as it takes shape. It's very early days yet, so I can't tell you much more about it than that. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand over to Phil, who going to say a little bit about his house. Now, I've just put a fabric picture there first to set the scene, but the next slide, when you're ready for it, Phil, is your renewable stuff.
Great, thanks, Tina. I'm probably in a very fortunate position here because we recently, a couple of years ago, took over a house that it had one storage heater in. The chimneys were blocked by jackdaw's nest. The place was as wet as it could be. It got gypsum plaster on the walls. There was no insulation. And it was an easy decision because it needed completely gutting and starting again. Now, I appreciate that most people are not in that situation, but it is a very, very fortunate one to be in because you can start from the beginning, from scratch, and try and do it properly. As we'll see, and Karen will tell you as well as everybody else, as Tina, if your best form of renewable energy is your insulation, really. So you need to get the place as insulated as you can, and then from there you can start planning what renewable energy systems you put in, because your heat demand will all depend on your levels of insulation and the size of your house and how you manage and want to use your water. So we've been very lucky. We just live just near Penruddock, and we have been fortunate enough to insulate it with lime, a hemp and perlite mix, do underfloor heating with a geocell base and a lime screed on there. We've dug up the floors, obviously. We've got thermofleece in the roof, but we are fortunate. It's not easy to rip your house apart and start again. So Rick, if you could go on to the next slide, please. Okay, this is yesterday. And I was actually late to this webinar because the digger driver has just left today. But after much deliberation, and again, I'm sure Karen, when she comes on to heat pumps, will help to explain this in greater depth. We ummed and we ahed about an air source heat pump versus a ground source heat pump in loops. We're in a strange scenario at the moment where we've got the renewable heat incentive, which really makes the decision on heating slightly dependent on whether you're going to be able to receive that heat incentive or not. Ewen, who's going to be speaking about solar PV, will tell you now that all of the gloves are off. There's no government incentives for it, and therefore it's straight down to market forces and whether you believe in lowering your carbon and so forth. But when you've got an incentive like the renewable heat incentive, then absolutely it does color your vision. It can color your vision as to whether you go for an air source heat pump and a ground source heat pump. Karen, I'm setting you up for later on. I hope in a good way. But Rick, do you want to go to the next picture if we've got something on here? Oh yeah, there we go. Problems. So an air source heat pump, which Karen will explain later, is, to my mind, is almost a fit and forget. It's a cassette type approach. They have come on in leaps and leaps and leaps and bounds in the last few years. The coefficient of performance, how well they perform, is really not that far off for most of the year, a ground source heat pump. Next slide, Rick, if you could. If there's, no. you better go back a couple. If you could go back a couple, that would be great. And one more. So and into the forward one, please. That's it. So air source heat pump, fit and forget in a day or so, or a couple of days. Its performance for most of the year can be up to 4.2, a seasonal coefficient of performance of 4.2. This is a ground source heat pump. It claims to have a coefficient of performance of around 4.6. So there's not a huge amount of difference, but most people putting in loops like we've had to put in, so 750 meters of loop into a field is not something that most people are fortunate to have. Obviously, the alternative is boreholes. Boreholes tend to be quite expensive. There's a lot of work that goes into the ground source heat pumps, and their efficiency is obviously particularly or comparatively good during the winter months when the air temperature is very cold, but the ground temperature remains relatively similar to other times of the year. I've really just put in these slides, as I say, they're very fresh from yesterday. A couple of points for anyone that's considering ground source heat pumps and doing loops, and I will respond to any questions that you've got. But it's absolutely key that you do some ground investigations to begin with, because actually what quite a lot of installers won't tell you is that depending on the soil type that you have different coefficients of performance. So there's different conductivity in the soil. If you just have a sandy soil, a dry sandy soil, you're not actually going to get I would actually have gone for an air source heat pump if we'd had dry sandy soil. We're very fortunate enough to have wet clayey soil with a bit of sand in it, and so the conductivity is extremely good. But there's lots and lots of nuances, and I would say, and I'm going to finish, Tina, by saying that whatever you decide to do and to use, please put the renewable energy installers on the spot and ask them what could go wrong, and what's the best scenario. Because you will have seen in the next slide, Rick, I think it was the next slide. Yes, a kink in the pipe, that's a 250 meter pipe, and a kink in that needs potentially a fusion weld, which needs someone to come out and fusion weld it. So you need to consider when you're installing something, how easy it is to install. And I'll go on about a ground source heat pump later on, but I'll just finish there, Tina. It just gives people a little bit of an introduction to ground source heat pumps and the deliberations about air source and ground source if you're lucky enough to have the land.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Phil. So that's great, the intro. So we'll move on to Ewen now, who's going to talk about PV panels. So a change of subject there, but we'll come back to Karen, who'll be talking more about heat pumps towards the end. So over to you, Ewen.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ewen. I am the MD of Love Solar. Love Solar has been trading for the last 9 to 12 years. Goes by fast. Established in 2009. In that time, we've sort of seen a lot of changes in the solar industry. When we started, the feed-in tariffs had just started, and we went from basically one person to about 20 in about a year, and then the feed-in tariffs stopped, cut off at the knees by the government, very short notice, and we went down to back to being a one-man band again. In the last few years, we've started to build up a team again, so now we've got a four-man team. Are very reliable and trustworthy and efficient, workers. We use a lot of in-house for the installation, but we use outsourced roofers and electricians to carry out a lot of the work. Next slide, please, Rick. So yeah, solar is basically what we do. We've looked at other technologies, but solar is what we do best and what we know most about. We do every form of installation, from domestic, commercial, agricultural, and community. Domestic has been the mainstay of our installation-wise for the last few years, largely new builds. in the last 2 or 3 years, primarily because the feed-in tariffs have dropped off and the requirements for SAT requirements for building regulations have come up. And when you're building a new house, solar is you know, it really makes a lot of sense. When you're putting on a new roof, your roof materials in the Lake District can cost more than the solar panels. Often a solar system is actually cheaper than the slates on the roof. So yeah, we do all aspects of solar. Commercial starting to come back on board now a lot. The economics make an awful lot of sense. Find there's no feed-in tariff, but the savings that are made on your actual electricity bill make an awful lot of sense, and the payback periods are fantastic. Next slide, please, Rick. Okay, I say solar for every occasion, depending on what sort of roof property or property you have, we can find you know, a solution for you. Ground mounts are a very good solution. You need planning permission if you put ground mount in. Usually within the curtilage of your own property, planning officials are very accommodating. Out with the curtilage, then planning permission is required regardless, inside your curtilage or outside your curtilage. But yeah, the outside the curtilage are not so amenable, but inside the curtilage they're pretty good. Planning for new builds, no problem whatsoever. We very rarely get turned down for any applications for solar. It's actually classed as permissive development, so it's actually not even acquired, but we tend to make planners aware of it. For retrofits, again, unless your building's a listed building, then it's permitted development, and you're absolutely fine to go with it. So the economics of solar has changed somewhat in the last few years, primarily because, say, there's no feed-in tariff. So it's all about utilizing the power that you generate in the home. Yeah, this is where it's at. So your savings on solar, it's basically 15 pence a unit is your saving you're making your solar. And yeah, in Eden Valley, basically you generate about 3,600 kilowatt hours a year on a south-facing roof with 4 kilowatts. Next slide, please, Rick. Okay, so as the feed-in tariffs have gone, it's all about utilizing the power that you generate. Where it's, batteries have come in a big way in the last 2 years. Batteries will basically utilize or save the power that you generate throughout the day. Also, they have the ability to be able to charge up from off-peak power, so you basically make a large saving. Car charging is also a very good way of saving your power, and is a good alternative to having a battery. If you think about a car is calculated 64 kilowatt hours of storage, whereas your standard household battery has 8 kilowatts. So to put your surplus power into your car makes an awful lot of sense. We do off-grid, large scale off-grid. There are a lot of chicken sheds, 25 to 50 kilowatt chicken sheds, which are challenging, but not insurmountable. Then farms, and also small off-grid for cabins and garden rooms. But yeah, we do it all. Okay, next slide, please, Rick. Okay, so as a local company, we're based in Penrith. So over 600 installations throughout the county. We will come to your site. We'll carry out a survey. We'll look at the best option you have. With solar, it's really down to the space you have on your roof or the availability in your garden. The size is not limited. Historically, it's always been 4 kilowatts has been the maximum amount you're allowed, but the DNO has become a lot more accommodating and allowing larger systems to be put on. But if you put a large system of 4 kilowatts, then you have to have a grid check, and they'll tell you what you're allowed to feed back in. If they don't allow any more than 4 kilowatts, but you want to have a bigger system, then you could put on a export limitation device. So you can actually, it limits the amount you can export to the grid, but allows you to utilize the power in the house. What we're finding now is an awful lot of the systems in the market, what people are demanding is where aesthetics are important. So standard on-top systems, which were, you know, the mainstay 8 years ago, 10 years ago, people are wanting to have in-roof systems. So, which basically means that you either remove the slates or tiles in your roof and fit it in, or if you're re-roofing, then you build them into the roof that way. Again, it's the systems perform just as well as on-top system, but the aesthetics are a lot more. So yeah, it's open to questions. We know an awful lot about solar. Solar's what we do. We've been doing it for the last 12 years, and yeah, any questions you have, please put them to me later on. Okay, thank you, Tina.
Thanks very much, Ewan. That's great. So keep those questions coming in, preferably in the Q&A, because then it links the question and the answer together. Whereas in the chat, it just shows the question, and then, you know, 5 questions later you get an answer to the first question. So look out for the Q&A. We're answering those. I'm looking at those as we go along. So Rick, if you could take on to the next slide, please. So Richard, over to you. Richard is a member of Penrith Action for Climate Change. I think have I got that right? No.
Penrith Action for Community Transitions.
That's the one. Yes, thank you very much. As well, I think I'll leave it to you to tell everyone what you've been up to.
Oh, I wear a number of different hats, but I'll proudly wear the PACT hat as well. I'm also the Diocesan Environment Officer as well for the Diocese of Carlisle. But I'm probably the least experienced out of everyone on the panel. But what I hopefully can do is to provide you a little bit of a case study to sort of illustrate a sort of a North Cumbria illustration of how some of these technologies can work in combination. And this is something which is relatively new for me. It was a system that was installed earlier on this January. So I'll try and provide you with a sort of like a case study illustration of how some of these technologies can work in combination. Next slide, please, Rick. And my sort of journey into this is I've had a battery electric vehicle for about 2.5 years. My day job is as a geography lecturer down at Keele University. So I do, in ordinary times, I do about 20,000 miles a year. So I thought the best way in which I could both kind of reduce my carbon footprint and to save some money was certainly in terms of the fuel costs, was to make that transition to a battery electric vehicle. And it was having a battery electric vehicle which got me interested, much more energy conscious, aware of the value of energy, and that sense of what a kilowatt hour was, you know, as a unit of energy that could get me sort of about 4 miles or so down the road. So then the next step, and obviously in a situation where you can then refuel that vehicle at home, was to then look at generating power at home yourself. Next slide, please, Rick. So it was only in January this year, in probably the snowiest weather we had, and also in the midst of the lockdown, that we had a solar PV, well, a system installed, which is a combination of a solar PV array and a domestic battery. So I thought there might be some people here who'd be interested in more of the technical side of things. So it's as Ewan was talking about, it's an in-roof solar PV array. It's 12 395 watt sun power panels. So a sort of like a maximum capacity of about 4.7 kilowatts. And then there's a Fronius string inverter, and then an estimated annual output of just over 4,000 kilowatt hours. Next slide, please. So I thought some of you might want some sort of statistics in terms of just how, I mean, it's only been installed within January. But I think one of the take-home things, one of the surprises for me is just how well it's performed, even in situations where you've not got direct sunlight, and even in the course of the, you know, some of the parts of the year when there's not so much sort of sunlight. So just, you know, these are something which will be there as a recording, and something which you can kind of provide an illustration of some of the stats so far. So in January, as you can see, it was installed middle of the month, just 76 kilowatt hours. But even in January, you'll see the solar offset. It was providing half of the energy that was being used in the house. Next slide, next click, please. By the time we got into February, the first full month, 240 kilowatt hours, so about 2/3 of our energy use. Next click. Then in March, 437. So now already 124%. So generating more energy than we're using within the household. So having a genuine surplus. And the next slide. And then clearly April last month was exceptional. So over 700 kilowatt hours generated last month, and over 200% of the energy that they're using both in the house and within the car, which means that we've got this surplus that can then start to think about how to make use of in future. Next click, please. Obviously, we're very used to dealing with intermittent resources, and there is clearly a day-night cycle associated with solar PV. So right from the word go, and as Ewen was highlighted now with the loss of the feed-in tariff, it's all about making the best use of the energy you generate. So right from the word go, I was interested in the prospect of energy storage. So we've got a Tesla Powerwall, which is one of the larger batteries, a capacity of just over 13 kilowatt hours, and can also charge and discharge at up to 5 kilowatts. So the kind of thing where, at night, then you can run an oven and run a kettle at the same time, and the battery can can provide that power. But as you see on the image on the right hand side, that shows that the yellow bar is the yellow above the line is showing the solar PV that's being generated. And then you can see the green bar below the axis is showing, the majority of the energy was going into the battery. And then if you look on the right hand side, you can say that that stored solar energy is then being used to run the house in the evening and overnight. So it enables you to use that solar energy over the course of that whole diurnal cycle. And what I found is also, even if you have a cloudy day, if you've got a sunny day and then a cloudy day and then another sunny day, you can run basically off grid throughout those cloudy days. So basically you're able to have much greater self-sufficiency and limit your grid usage. Next slide, please. And I thought, it can all seem incredibly technical, but we're used to dealing with intermittent resources. We're all used to having intermittent supplies of precipitation and rainfall. And we're, probably, I'm sure a number of you are keen gardeners, are used to having a storage facility in the form of water butts. And all you're doing in that sort of situation is capturing that resource at times of plenty, so you can then use it at times when it's less plentiful. Next click, please. So ultimately, again, just some more statistics. Then it's that combination of the solar and the domestic battery that mean that so far, sort of to date, then about 80% of our energy has come ultimately from the solar PV array, and only 20% from the grid. Next click. And as Ewen has already mentioned, I think the other use to bear in mind in terms of the use of batteries is their ability to take advantage of time of use tariffs. So the cost and also the carbon intensity of energy varies, on an hourly basis, and there are even situations where the price can go negative overnight, in which case you can end up being paid to take energy off the grid. And if you've got a battery, then you can take advantage of that, charge the battery when energy is clean and green, and then use that energy in order to make sure you're not using the grid when it's more expensive and more carbon intensive. Next click, please. And then one of the things that's fascinated me in terms of having that battery electric vehicle is that now you're in a situation where you can use your solar PV basically to charge your vehicle as well. So now we're in a situation where you've got that connection between energy generation and your own mobility. So I had a My Energy Zappy installed. That's a sort of like a smarter car charger, which enables you to divert surplus solar to the car. And so to date, I've put about 300 kilowatt hours of surplus solar into the car, which amounts to about 1,200 miles of, I say advisedly, free driving at an efficiency of 4 miles per kilowatt hour. So, as we move into a situation where, it'll be less than 10 years when the sale of combustion engine vehicles will be banned, then there's that opportunity to think about the ways in which solar PV might contribute to your mobility. Next slide, please. And the next step, and I should say I've not gone down the heating route yet, so I'm really interested to hear to the other people and looking forward to the next part, would be to install a smart hot water tank. So then in that situation, start to think about the ways in which you can use that energy as a homegrown resource, initially to run the house, then to charge the battery, then to heat the hot water tank, then to charge the car. And as Ewen is alluding to it, the last thing you want to do, because you won't get much money for it, is to eventually to export to the grid. Next click. That just shows that basically, that will be the current sort of order of priorities. Next click, almost there. So another click, yeah. So basically my experiences today, only being like 4 months in, our solar PV definitely works well in Cumbria. It's not something which only works down in the south or sunnier parts of the country. Next click. And the thing that surprised me is you can generate significant energy even on cloudy days. At the moment, even on overcast days, I'm generating about 15 kilowatt hours. Next slide. Incorporating, there is a cost associated with that, but incorporating a domestic battery enables you to use that solar energy overnight and to become much more self-sufficient. Next click. And it will also has that benefit of being able to use time of use tariffs, which I think are going to become progressively more and more important and influential as we have more and more renewables in the energy mix in the UK. The final click. And then if you end up thinking about the potential switch to a battery electric vehicle, there's a connection there, and then the opportunity to make use of that homegrown solar to end up providing free miles within your vehicle as well. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's been great. Thank you. I think we'll move swiftly on to Karen, who's going to talk a bit about heat pumps. And again, keep the questions coming. That's brilliant. We can see we've got quite a few questions coming in, so just keep typing them away. And some of the panel are answering them as we go along as well in the Q&A form. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Mitchell. I've been involved with renewables in Cumbria since 2002. I work for Rowland Hill. I'm going to just do a little overview on heat pumps and say very little on Tesla Powerwall because Richard did such a good job. Next slide, please. So what is a heat pump? I think the knowledge base looking at the poll, the opening poll is quite high on this webinar. So I think most of you will know that a heat pump is basically a transfer of energy from one place to the other, whether we're transferring from the ground, like Phil's doing, from the air, or whether we're transferring from water, and that can be open or closed loop. So the three different types we do is ground, air and water source heat pumps. Sizing, as Phil mentioned, is really important. In a new build, beautifully insulated with a low heat demand, a heat pump is a very easy decision, and it will give you years of low maintenance, heating and plentiful of hot water. However, in a retrofit situation, I always think we need to take a bit of a deep breath, and we need to look at what is the heat loss of the building? How can the heat loss of the building be improved? The heat emitters, the radiators, the underfloor heating, is there sufficient in the house to run at a low temperature to mean that you can still be warm enough, but it's an efficient system that can be a low cost system? And there are houses where heat pumps are not the right solution. And I will always say fabric first. Depending on the fabric of the property will depend which renewable is right for you. I'll talk about domestic hot water, as in domestic hot water and heat pumps works very well if the design is correct. How many baths, how many showers, how many heat pumps. So although we're storing water, the recovery is slower. So the design for hot water really needs to be quite carefully considered. Next slide, please. So a ground source heat pump or a water source heat pump, because they both pretty much work the same way, has a higher SCOP, which is your seasonal coefficients of performance. kind of 15, 20 years ago, it was always COP. And a lot of the COPs, the coefficients of performance, was not a good figure because it was all based on +11. Everything works on +11. So the seasonal COP is much more important. Actually, in this cold heating season, how is this heat pump going to perform? Heat pumps have grown up a lot over the years. So even with ground source now, we can go up to 22 kilowatts on single phase. They will condense, they can modulate. They don't have the huge soft, slow starts they used to have. So the efficiency is better. If you're using ground pipes like fill, then the basic things you need to remember that you'll probably need about 2.5 times your floor space outside for your ground loops. Loops will need to be 1 meter apart, 1.2 meters down, and 1 meter from your boundary. And we're looking at what the land value is, what is the land, what is the solar gain on the land, to make sure that we're not taking out more than the sun can put back in. Boreholes are typically 100 to 150 meters deep. Extract in Cumbria normally around 4 kilowatts of a hole. So a standard house can easily want 3 holes. And on average, they're about £6,000 a hole. So you've got a much bigger capital cost with a ground source heat pump. 20 years ago, if you had a choice between a ground and an air, you would always want to do a ground. But air source have changed. Next slide, please. Air source heat pumps. Okay, there's 2 on there. There's a little Mitsubishi EcoDan, which is one of my favorites at the moment because it's kind of ultra quiet, as in the electric car quiet. And there's an LG on there. Pros and cons to both. We can do up to 16 kilowatts now on single phase. However, there are some heat pumps, usually below 12 kilowatts, that you install and notify the district network office, Electric Northwest, that's installed. And there's other where, like with Ewen was saying with PV, you need to check the grid and get permission before installing. But I think that's a much more simple process now. So an air source heat pump, as Phil was saying, the coefficients of performance in the season, they're much, much closer now. There is little in them in terms of performance. You will always get slightly better from a ground source than an air source. With the renewable heat incentive, you will make so much more money with a ground source heat pump, but you've got a higher capital cost. So it's kind of weighing it all up. I think heat pumps air source got a bad name in about 2004, and that was actually really good because they were being put in the wrong place. They were being put in uninsulated houses, single glazed sash windows, and they were costing people a fortune to run, and they weren't warm enough. And I think air source heat pump have grown up far more than ground source over the years, and they're really quite a good option now. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to say much about Tesla flat Powerwalls because Richard kind of did that brilliantly. He said it's 13.5 kilowatts battery storage. The actual Powerwall can be fitted internally or externally. He mentioned 5 kilowatts continual power. So we're finding with the Powerwalls that we've got a 6-month lead time generally to get a Powerwall. The cold and high temperature controls are really good because they keep working at higher and lower temperatures and it's all protected. My boss has one in his house and I think daily I get reports. So he has a ground source heat pump in a barn conversion with 4 kilowatts of PV and a Tesla Powerwall. So on yesterday he has a heat pump, so he has quite a high electric demand, and the Powerwall gave all the electricity for the whole house for the whole day, and he exported. Octopus Energy now have an interesting tariff. Richard, you might know this. So if you went to the Octopus Energy plan and you have solar PV and a Tesla Powerwall, then you can buy electricity at 11p per kilowatt hour, and you can export at 11p per kilowatt hour and no standing charge. But I'm going to leave Powerwall there because I think Richard covered that beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That's fantastic. So that's brilliant. So we've now got something in the region of half an hour for us to answer the questions. Rick, do you want to go on to the next slide? I think we can actually stop sharing the screen now and open it up to the questions that have been coming in. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Rick. So I've grouped some of these questions that you've been sending in. There's some really good questions there. Some of them have been answered behind the scenes as we go along, but I think it'd be really useful to cover them under topics, even if they have been answered, and just to give each panelist or certain panelists a chance to say a few words about them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just not in any particular order, but I'm going to start with some heat pump related questions. And then I will move on to some more PV and battery related questions. So if I start with a couple of general questions, Alice has a general question about ground source and air source heat pumps, and says they need much bigger radiators in the rooms and therefore might require complete replumbing. They will cover a lot of the existing walls, and then you can't have furniture on those walls. And the alternative is underfloor heating, which would mean taking up the existing floors. And she just wants to check whether she's understood that correctly. So would anyone like to take that one on?
Shall I take that one? Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. When you're having a heat pump, it's really important that that heat pump can run at as low a flow temperature as possible because of efficiency and long-term running costs. Now, in an existing situation, we're looking at the flow and return sizes from the radiators. 15 mil pipe rather than microbore is always better. And there are times where radiators, yes, do have to be upsized. However, I'm finding that a lot of old radiators, the new ones are more efficient, and the new ones you can kind of have a double panel and a double fin. So you can have 4 ways to emit the heat using often the same space.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. And to follow on, I have another question relating to heat pumps. And that is, someone again answering about radiators. They have a large hot water tank. If we fitted air source or ground source heat pumps, is one a lot cheaper to fit? And would we get a warm house using the radiators that we've got? So relating to the last question, really, if we insulate the house well enough. And so we have room for ground source as well as obviously for air source.
I would think it's probably worth just doing a feasibility on both ground and air to see which works better for you. Each house is different. The more you insulate, the better. Always start with insulation, because if we're not losing heat, we're not paying to put it back in our homes. So I think in some ways that's a more important thing to do than a heat pump. That must be your start. And without a proper survey and looking at how many watts per meter squared you need, and then working out what your ideal radiator sizes are, they could change.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we'll just have a couple more questions on heat pumps, because we've got a couple in on air source and a couple on ground source. So there's one from Deb, I think one of the first questions, about additional energy source required for her Cumbrian farmhouse. She has a stove and runs central heating, hot water and the cooking, but it relies on them being at home and stoking the fire. So they'd like a second source of heat to run the heating and the hot water when they're not around. And they've thought about air source, but wonder if it would work in conjunction with their stove. They have access to woodland and plenty of seasoned wood. So, you know, they don't want to get rid of their stove as it is. And could they set up a system that allows the two systems to work in conjunction with each other? Or have you got some other suggestions?
Shall I take this one?
Okay, yes, go for it.
Okay, so heat pumps, as in two different systems, bivalent systems are possible. And there are air source in particular heat pumps on the market that can cope with that and can cope with, you know, if you've got, say, an oil boiler and a heat pump, that which should be being used when, and when you've got both and when the oil takes over. So yes, now mixing a wood stove with a back boiler with an air source heat pump is tricky for lots of reasons. One's a vented plumbing system, one's an unvented system, one's a very hot system, one's a low temperature system. It's not impossible, but you'd have to feed into some big thermal store with different coils in to be able to do that. However, if you mix those two systems together, you're not compliant for RHI, so there's no renewable heat incentive return for 7 years. It's not impossible, it's rarely done, and it's not easy.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, one final question on heat pumps that I'm going to ask right now, which is about water source potentially. Tony says, I have a perennial beck on my property boundary, and what options could I consider to harness that? And maybe Phil, if anyone's got any other ideas that aren't a heat pump, could follow on with something there. But Karen, what do you think?
I mean, obviously, there's the consideration of whether you can put it in hydro, because all of the hydro feed-in tariffs are vended, then you need to do your sums very carefully, because they tend to be an expensive, you know, very capitally intensive form of renewable energy, albeit that once they're fitted, then hopefully they provide a great source of heat and energy at the time of year when you need the most, i.e. during the winter and heavy rainfalls. So if that's not feasible, either because you don't have either the necessary flow, or because it's too expensive, or because your beck is potentially in an environmentally sensitive area, you will need consent and planning permission for that hydro if you're extracting any water at all. So there's an awful lot of hoops to go through. That's not saying that you can't do it, but there's a company in Wales called Green Valleys Hydro, which do a lot of pico, or very small hydros. It might be worth looking at that. Water source heat pumps are growing in, I say popularity, but they're being deployed more regularly. There is also so effectively you're putting loops in a water medium. The safest of those are obviously within a pond or a lake where high water isn't going to cause problems. If you're putting pipes into a beck which floods, some people might say, oh, well, all you need to do is sort of weight them down with some sandbags, that'd be fine. But if anyone's experienced 2009, 2015, 2018, and the floodings that we get, you'll know that becks rise dramatically. There is another system that's come to the marketplace recently, which is effectively like putting a radiator into a beck. So rather than putting a pipe, you're effectively putting a radiator type system in, and that can give you a couple of extra kilowatts of energy. It just simply works like any heat pump, except that rather than being a loop, it's actually a radiator with fins. And again, that has to be secured to the bottom of the beck. But I mean, we looked at doing some of this on our farm, but it floods too vigorously and I just didn't want to have the worry that every time the beck floods that the equipment's going to be taken away.
Okay, thanks. Karen, did you want to add anything on that one?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, using the beck, as Phil said, is tricky, and I would kind of avoid it. I've done a couple of closed loop lake or pond where you basically put it in the pond, you take it out and you sink it, that's fine. I've done a couple of open loop. So if somebody's got a jetty, I've got one out of Coniston that was done about 12 years ago, where out the jetty we actually took open loop, and we're currently installing one on the shore of Windermere where we've got an open loop. So it's just making sure all the glycol or the inhibitor we use is kind of safe. It's not refrigerant based, it's natural based, and make sure that it's going through enough purification and you've got enough liters per second. If you're going to have loops in a lake, I'd always like to see them at 2 meters deep, as Phil said, where they're safe. So they're not very common, but they're quite good fun to do.
Okay, that's brilliant, thank you. Well, I think we're going to move on because we've got quite a lot of PV questions now. So I'm going to start on the PV questions. For those panelists who are looking through the Q&A and you notice there's a question that hasn't been answered yet, then please do go ahead and feel free to put your answer in there. That would be brilliant. I see some of you have actually answered questions, so that's fine. We can always answer them again as well. So I'm going to move on to a couple of PV questions. So the first one from Jocelyn, she says, how does fitting PV panels interact with insulation requirements for a room in the roof? And who would like to, Ewen, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so insulation requirements being insulation built into the roof, as in a warm roof?
I think what she means is, if she's going to insulate her room in the roof properly, obviously if she's doing it on the inside internally, then there may not be any impact on whether the PV panels go on. But of course, if you're going to take your tiles off and retile and refelt and maybe insulate over the rafters, which is a very good option in terms of insulation potentially, then you would want to do all of that and perhaps tie it in with getting the panels put on while the scaffolding's up, for example. But you don't want to mess around once you've got the PV up to start with, messing around with your tiles again. So I don't know if you've done any of those where you've tied in with existing work.
Answer the question, Tina. Yeah, on a standard roof with insulation in the attic, then solar has no effect. Solar panels have no effect on the actual insulation of the roof, because they basically either sit on top of the roof and the tiles and slates underneath, or if they're built in, then they act as a slate to the tiles. And basically slates the tiles have got no thermal capabilities anyway. So solar won't have any negative effect or positive effect on the insulation. If you're doing a warm roof where you're basically fitting, there's no attic space and there's rigid insulation between the rafters, then again, insulation that's in the attics, between the rafters, acts as insulation, and the solar PV will form no insulation, negative or positive at all. Does that answer the question, everybody, would you say?
Okay. Well, Jocelyn, perhaps come back to us if you've got anything else relating to that, but hopefully that's your question answered. And I'll move on to a question about solar tiles or solar panels. Is there any difference between them apart from the aesthetics?
The solar slates, so on top PV or in roof solar, obviously the aesthetics are a big player. In roof solar is a lot more attractive on top systems. There's an argument that there's a small amount of efficiency lost in roof systems because there's no ventilation underneath the panels. Research has shown this is in single figures. You're talking 3 to 5%. So it's very small and not a big issue in Cumbria. Possibly if you go further south where it's hotter, or into the continent of Europe, then it becomes a bigger issue. It's not in our region. Again, if you live in the Lake District and you have to slate with natural Burlington or Westmoreland green slates, and the price of slates are more expensive than the PV. So if you build it into the roof, then you're almost getting a solar system for nothing. Yeah, it's cheaper. We did a system recently near Shap, and the system cost of the PV was £8,000 on the south side. On the north side, it was £14,000 with slate, and that's a real time, real life job. So he was pleading for me to put it on the north side, but it was over his requirement. So.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that. That's brilliant. So I'll move on to a couple of battery questions, and I think I'll go to Barbara, who says, I've been advised to wait before installing a battery as prices will fall and efficiency will increase. So, you know, how close is it now to being economic from a payback viewpoint, would you say?
I can answer this, but Karen might want to contribute. Batteries wipe their own nose economically. They'll pay for themselves in their lifespan. They get a 10-year life expectancy. They'll certainly pay for themselves in that time, but they're not a big income generator. So they're getting cheaper all the time, and efficiency is getting better, and the storage capacity is getting better. So that happens, then of course the payback period will get shorter and the returns will get better. At present, you know, they'll certainly pay for themselves, but they won't make you rich.
Okay, thank you. Karen, do you want to add anything to that? No, that's fine. Or Richard, have you got something?
I just think the thing interesting longer term will be as we get a significant increase in the amount of offshore wind that's being added into the energy mix in the UK. There's going to be a greater amount of sort of like, you know, potential intermittency, and I guess that sort of potential for cheap, clean energy, particularly in the winter. The thing that sort of struck me is that then when you've got obviously the solar, you're generating that much better yield over the course of the summer months, but then over the course of the winter, when you've got much more in the way of wind, that seems to be when you're getting the really significant price drops. And therefore, then if you've got that sort of battery as part of the sort of system, then you've got that ability to sort of capitalize on that and to take advantage of those, you know, of that cheap energy overnight. So it becomes quite a sort of complicated. It's that sort of sense of the, you know, the battery is fulfilling sort of multiple purposes. And, you know, there is that sort of sense. I think one of the interesting things that we've not really touched upon as well, whilst we're in this sort of discussion, is potentially, I guess, over the next few years, we'll see the more widespread adoption of vehicle, you know, a vehicle to home. A vehicle, you know, as people say about your car, you know, if you've got a battery electric vehicle and the car is probably spent, you know, maybe 95% of the time just sort of sat there on a drive doing nothing. And as Ewen highlighted, they're massive batteries on wheels. So, you know, the potential in those situations for them to provide that, you know, that energy storage as well. And maybe one last thing that I found, which is, I suppose as these new technologies develop, you start to identify ways in which you can actually work with them and use them. So I found sort of situations where, say, for example, I want to put a bit more of a sort of like a quick charge into the car. I can then charge the car on a combination of current solar and stored solar discharging from the battery. So you can sort of double that charge rate while still sort of staying off grid. So I think it's really exciting that way in which, you know, these technologies will start to develop, and I think those sort of use cases will progress quite rapidly over the, you know, the next few years.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Richard. That's brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to move slightly on to some other fabric and heating system related questions. That we've got one from Anthea asking about an old stone house which was done up badly some time ago, and then perhaps follow that with one from Tim Cottingham also about an old stone cottage. So I just wondered if Phil, if you'd be happy to start off talking about those two examples from Anthea and from Tim. Would that be okay? And then hand over to anyone else who wants to chip in.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't quite find the questions there again. Could you just
So yes, sure. I'll start reading out Anthea.
Yeah.
So she says, we have an old stone house which has been done up badly by us 20 years ago. we know we need to tackle the structure before we put in any green energy, but we don't have a lot of spare cash, and we don't want to pull it all apart and start again. There's lots of cement and so on. We've looked at solar and air source. We keep going around in circles because of the cost, and not very warm. We keep putting on lots of jumpers. So wondering where to start, and they're not eligible for any grants. And are there any case studies of old stone houses where people are doing this on a real budget, on a tight budget?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim poverty here, but we're doing it pretty much all of ourselves. And I work for CAFS, which is a charity, so not on a whacking wage. I've been living in a stone house, which was beautifully plastered with gypsum 25 years ago. And when the wind whistles and it gets through the cement pointing on the outside, it goes straight into the lovely sandy walls. And then we just try and heat it, and we put on jumpers, and we get up in the morning and freeze our toes off. And so, we've in this property have, not the new one, in the property thought, what should we do? Should we put on, should we go for air source heat pump? But the reality is that, we can just throw energy at it, and it's just going to sink into these cold, wet walls. And I do sympathize with everybody that destroying your house, in inverted commas, to get some insulation and onto the walls just feels just a dreadful thing to do. It's disruptive. It is relatively expensive if you're on a limited budget, but there's no other way. I don't feel like, Tina will tell you that the first point of call is your chimney. Start from the top down. And so, in the property that we have, the chimneys were wet. All of the water was coming down into the following the joint lines, and it had got gypsum plaster on it. And when we chipped the gypsum plaster off the walls, I promise you could have filled up half a mug in a day from some of the walls, how wet they were. And within 2 months, they dried out completely. And actually going about by, I've sent some links in responding to a further question about going on the CAF's website. There's a retrofit property in Appleby where they've taken off all the gypsum and they've gone about it. And, it isn't cheap, but it's not as bling as renewable energy, I have to say. And it is, even Karen, whose job it is to sell you renewable energy, is advising you to do these things first. But don't get me wrong, it's not easy, it's not fun, it's a big task. And I have every sympathy for the dozens of people watching this whose walls have been done up by, with gypsum plaster. If the walls are dry and they're, the water's not ingressing, then you're at a good starting point. But as soon as your walls are damp, it's really hard to get them warm again. Tina, maybe you want to add something to that. This is your.
No, I think you covered that really well, Phil. I think that's well and truly covered that one. So I'm going to move on to some other questions, because we have got a number of questions that haven't been answered either by us talking or typed an answer into the Q&A. So I'm going to tackle a few of those. But if panel members, if you see a question in the Q&A where you could actually type an answer, then please feel free to do so, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm just going to see how many of these final questions I can get through. So very quickly, no one's mentioned air tightness. How important does the panel feel it is? Well, I'll answer that one myself. Very important. It's really great if you can get rid of the drafts. It's the most effective way of reducing heat loss from your house, but do compensate by putting in controlled ventilation. It doesn't do any good to have a house without proper ventilation, but you want to control the ventilation when you're cooking and having a shower, not just ventilation when the wind blows. So doing the best you can with air tightness is really, really good idea. I will put a question. I've got a question here. I've heard of Magic Box for hot water. What does Ewen think about Magic Box? Do you know much about it, Ewen?
Magic Box. I've seen the literature on them. Thermodynamic boxes. I've never actually met somebody who's had one fitted. They kind of, unfortunately, seem to get bad press for some reason. Maybe that's down to the fact that the people who sell them and install them are not so reputable. But no, actually, firsthand, I have never met anybody ever who's had one fitted, believe it or not. So unfortunately, I can't speak with authority on it.
Okay, got a couple of heat pumps questions. What's the typical cost to run an air source heat pump per kilowatt hour? Does anyone have a sense of that? Right, it's electricity, isn't it? So it's per kilowatt hour. It's the same, but I think perhaps we need to explain what the special thing is about the air source heat pump that makes that cheaper than a direct electric radiator. Who wants to? Karen?
Yeah, I'll take this. Your air source heat pump, when we keep talking about this coefficients and seasonal coefficients of performance, if a coefficient of performance is 3.5, that means for every kilowatt of electricity you use, you've got 3.5 kilowatts free of charge. So it all depends on, we're back to properties and we're back to running temperature. A lovely new build house, maybe 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, 2 showers, 4 people, that kind of house, you're probably looking at somewhere between £550 and £600 a year to run. A large house with a larger heat pump with a larger heat loss, then that running cost per kilowatt hour will go up because you might have a COP of 2. So it's only, you know, for every kilowatt you use, you get 1 free of charge. So it really is per property, per feasibility. And you should always have those figures up front as part of your feasibility on considering a heat pump.
That's great. Thanks, Karen. And what's your thoughts on hybrid air source heat pump, Karen?
Yeah, hybrid air source heat pumps. You've got some like bivalent systems. So you've got an oil boiler and an air source. I guess that's what they mean. And I think that's about control. If there's an oil boiler that's currently in, I would always leave the oil boiler to do the hot water. Because oil boilers like that consistency of use. If you don't switch them on for 6, 7, 8 months, you can guarantee they're not very happy to come on. So they like that base load. Then you can control it so the heat pump takes the first part of your load. When it's struggling, the oil boiler can come and help. And when it gets really, really cold, you can switch the heat pump off and let the oil boiler do it the whole for the, you know, however few weeks a year where it's below -5.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Well, I've got one more heat pump question, which I put to you, Karen, one more PV question, and then a general question for everyone. So first of all, the heat pump question. Tom says, can I use an air source heat pump to preheat a 2,500 litre thermal store, which is used by a biomass boiler?
Yes, not easily. You'd have to really look at the schematics. It makes me very nervous just thinking of the schematic. I could probably quite like to run away from that, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. And go for a question now. If you were creating an east and west facing roof, would you be able to do the entire roof inline PV and without slates?
Yes, you can. It's just a case of making sure that your roof fits the size of the solar PV panels which are available, because the solar PV panels come in a standard size, and you can extend your flashings either side of the panels to take up any space which might be free. But yeah, probably best to look at the available size of the panels and design your roof around that, I would say. But to have a small border of slates or tiles around the array doesn't look bad. It looks good.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And the final question, which I think everyone should get a chance to answer. Oh, it's just disappeared. Let me just find it again. So I'll just ask this one to round off, really. And I can't see it now. It was the one about if you were house hunting. Someone just answered that.
Yeah, someone just asked if they were house hunting, and what sort of house would they be looking for in order to do a good retrofit on it. And I did answer, but I don't be careful. Be careful when you look, because a house that's been an old house that's been done up recently, you need to be very careful to assess what it's been done up with, and whether it has literally and metaphorically plasterboard is hiding the proverbial cracks. So what I mean by that is that you can take any old building and you can do it up and make it look absolutely wonderful, and you can go and visit it on a cold day and it feels so warm and lovely and bright and special, but then you actually haven't seen the annual heating costs. So it may even be worth, as a different way of answering this question, ask to see the annual heating costs and ask to see some of the bills, and you'll get an idea how much it is going to cost to heat that house. Alternatively, look for a well-built house that hasn't been blinged up, and you can start from scratch and do it properly.
Anyone else want to add something onto that one? I mean, what I would say is that I've done exactly that in the past. I took a house that hadn't been touched for 50 or 60 years, had nothing done to it since it was built, and everything needed doing, the electrics, the plumbing, the roof, structural, yeah, all sorts of problems. And that was definitely the house to pull apart. We didn't feel guilty. The windows were falling out. Everything needed doing. That was a great start. So I think exactly as Phil says, if you find one that's just crying out for help and it hasn't had any work done on it or for a long time, you don't feel so bad about sorting it out properly. If it's really heartbreaking to go into somewhere that looks great and then have to start sorting it out without really being able to see what the problems are initially. So yeah. Hopefully that's helpful. So I think that's it. I think we have managed to get to the end of all the questions right on time. So if I could ask Rick to put the presentation back up for us, and we'll just finish off with a poll and so on. So hopefully we did manage to answer all of your questions, but if another question has come to mind or you think of something later, you can request a short advice call with one of our CAF's energy advisors, and the contact details are there. That's a 10-minute advice call. It's free. It doesn't matter. It's not based on eligibility of anything. Anyone in Cumbria can benefit from that service. Do give us a call. The next slide, please, Rick. So I'm going to put the poll up again, and exactly the same questions as last time. So let me just get that running, and it'd be great if you could answer that one as well. It might take me a few seconds to get to the next poll. There we go. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to complete those. Can everybody see the poll? Yeah, great. I can see answers coming in. Okay, so straight away I can see perhaps a few more people feel that they know a little bit more than at the beginning. I think perhaps everybody's moved up a notch in terms of feeling how much you know about if you started from a lower point. Okay, give a few more moments for people. Okay, I'll bring it to an end there then. In there. Okay, so I'll share that with you. So yes, it looks as if people picked up a few bits and pieces of information, of new information, and some are thinking about going on and doing something, whether that's looking at fabric or looking at new renewable technologies for the home. Thank you very much, everybody. So Rick, if we could go on to the next slide. So, oh, back one. I've got a final question. If we run more webinars like this one, what topics would you most like us to cover? And please just put your answers in the chat, because this will help us when we plan the next webinars and training courses. It's really helpful to us to know what people need, rather than just putting out a webinar on whatever random topic we happen to think would be useful. So as I finish off today, please drop any suggestions into the chat as to things you would like to see us cover if we do some more webinars in the next couple of months. And the next slide, please, Rick. So if you enjoyed the webinar, look out for more events on the CAF's website. For those who haven't already done so, please sign up to our newsletter on the homepage. And also, if you want to donate to CAF's, then that's also at the top of the homepage. Thank you, Rick. Next one. Right. Well, that's it. We've actually finished 5 minutes early. So I would like to say a very big thank you to the panelists for all of your contributions, for answering a lot of questions. We did get through quite a large number of questions today. And so I really hope that that's been useful for everyone who attended. And I would just like to say thank you very much for all of you who came in, asked your questions, and have given us some suggestions for future webinars. So thank you. I'm going to close it here, and hopefully see you next time when we run another one.